大家好，我是小辉。最近华尔街的主流声音还在讨论美联储什么时候降息但是今天呢，我要给大家带来一个完全不一样的声音，一个可能颠覆你所有认知的观点来自Ark基金的木头姐 Cathie Wood， 她最近再次发出重磅的预警我们现在根本不是在对抗通胀，而是在迎接一场由 AI 引爆的通缩的海啸，一场前所未有的生产力的大爆炸。她手里到底有什么硬核的数据让她如此笃定呢？今天我们就来深度拆解一下木頭姐的最新逻辑
Auto loan delinquencies.You can see they're as bad now as in COVID and in the aftermath of 08-09. So the green is 90 days late, and the purple is subprime. So those are the lower income. And so those delinquencies up at 5%, quite high by historical standards. In fact, we never saw delinquencies this high until the recession of 08-09.
木头姐首先指出，华尔街的精英可能忽略了经济中一个正在蔓延的金融困境她用一个非常直观的数据来佐证汽车贷款的拖欠率大家看一下这张图。现在呢，美国汽车贷款的拖欠率，尤其是那些次级贷款也就是信用评分比较低、收入不那么稳定的人群的贷款，拖欠率已经达到了 5% 这个数字呢，跟2020年疫情爆发初期，甚至2008、2009金融海啸之前之后一样糟糕。这不仅是一个数字，它反映的是美国的普通消费者，特别是中低收入人群他们的真实财务压力。当人们连汽车贷款都开始还不上的时候，他们的可支配收入必然受到挤压，消费能力自然会下降。这可不是一个通胀火热、经济强劲的经济体该有的一个表现反而更像是通缩压力的早期信号。
The dotted line you see is at 0. This is the year-over-year percent change in oil prices. And as you can see, they're down in the 15 to 20% range on a year-over-year basis.And what's also interesting here, so I say we could go down, 20 to 25%. What's happened in Venezuela recently could tip us. So in Venezuela, at its peak, Venezuela produced, I think, 3.5 to 3.75 million barrels per day. Now they're below 1 million, and I think they export much of that to China.Well, that dynamic is changing, and I think that more of that oil will come to the United States. So West Texas Intermediate oil prices could depart from Brent oil prices in a significant way, which would get the year-over-year price decline to something more than 25%. This is, in effect, a tax cut, another tax cut for the consumer.And we think will be passed along into gasoline prices. We know in many parts of the country, they're down below $3 a gallon. I think I've even heard of one part of the country down below $2 a gallon. We think that is going to continue. In other words, the price decline in gasoline. And in the midterm election year, that we think will become a very important gauge of affordability. We're surprised that it hasn't gotten into expectations for inflation in the University of Michigan survey, but we think it will the more months it continues to decline.Here you can see real estate prices, existing home price inflation in the green line and new home price inflation in the purple line. You can see new home price inflation has been negative. So prices have been falling for the last 3 years. I think they're down 7% from their peak.Existing home prices, not so, but the inflation rate has dropped from during COVID, it went to crazy levels, 20 to 25%. But recently it was in the 5% range, has come down to roughly 1.5%. And we think it may continue to come down, maybe even entering negative territory. One of the reasons for that is this inventory chart.This is the inventory of new one-family homes. So they're for sale. They haven't been sold. And you can see that this inventory is reaching towards levels hit before the 08-09 crisis. Now, the reason I'm featuring this chart again is I heard one of the commentators on the business news channels today saying, there are no houses for sale. That's not true. That's not true. This tells you there are a lot of new homes for sale, and builders are carrying them on their balance sheets. Now they're starting to cut prices. KB Home, in its third quarter report, reported a 7% average home price decline. Lennar, I think, was down 3%. No, I'm sorry, it was down 7 to 8% as well, and Lennar was down 3%. So they are now going beyond what was called buy downs, meaning they'd subsidize the mortgage rate. Now they're actually cutting prices. And we think that's going to get into not only the new home price, but also the existing home price, because this is competition, of course. So now the reason I'm focused on oil and housing is you take those two in the CPI, shelter and oil, and you're up to nearly 50% of the CPI, all of shelter, including energy, and then oil and gasoline by themselves. So we do think inflation is going to surprise on the low side of expectations, especially because so many people expect inflation to remain in the 3-ish% range.
一部分消费者已经开始感受到寒意啊，这会直接影响总的需求，进而呢传导到物价。木头姐接着把目光投向了 CPI 中最重要的两大组成部分，能源和住房，这两项加起来几乎占据了 CPI 50%的一个份额。如果这两大支柱出现结构性的变化，那么整体的通胀走向就非常明显了。首先看油价，现在的国际油价呢同比已经下跌了 15% 到 20%， 但是木头姐的分析更加深入，他认为随着国际地缘政治格局的变化，特别是委内瑞拉的石油产量将会回升，并且呢，更多的流向美国市场西德克萨斯的原油这个价格可能会跟这个布伦特原油出现明显的背离，跌幅呢甚至会超过 25%。为什么委内瑞拉的石油更重要呢？因为它是非欧派克的一个供应来源，一旦它的产量稳定，而且出口方转向美国，将直接增加美国本土市场的原油供给从而对这个 WTI 国际油价形成一个结构性的压制。这对于普通的消费者来说，就相当于是一次实实在在的减税直接降低了汽油价格。很多地方呢已经是跌破了3美元甚至是2美元一加仑。汽油价格的下降不仅直接减轻了家庭的开支，还会降低物流和生产的成本再看房价，很多人抱怨这个市场上没有房子卖，但是木头姐用数据打脸新房库存已经达到了2008-2009年金融危机前的一个水平，这意味着开发商手上有大量卖不出去的新房子现在他们不光是补贴这个房贷利率，甚至开始直接降价这个 KB Home 还有 Nino 这两个头部的开发商呢，平均房价跌幅已经达到了 3% 到 7%。所以呢，当油价和房价这两大定海神针都在往下走的时候，木头姐认为呢，通胀数据一定会低于市场的预期。当所有人还在预期 3% 左右的通胀时呢，他已经看到了通胀回落到 1.5% 甚至到负区间的可能就是通缩。
Here's another reason we expect prices to come down. So this is unit labor costs. And there again, you can see zero. We are at 1.4% on a year-over-year basis for non-farm unit labor costs. Now, the reason this one is so important is there are some Fed economists who remember the 70s and cost-push inflation. And that was inflation caused by labor costs. Consumers were going to their employers saying, I can't make ends meet. And so wages started pushing up. So wages, compensation per man hour are up about 3%, so roughly in line with inflation. But productivity is up 4.9% on a year over year. No, this is not year over year. 4.9% quarter to quarter. And compensation is 3% quarter to quarter. Those are at annualized rates. So quarter to quarter unit labor costs are roughly 1.9%. Year over year, they've dropped to 1.2%. Now, this looks nothing like the 60s and 70s when cost push inflation was the problem. And in fact, if we're right and productivity continues to accelerate, unit labor costs could move into negative territory in the absence of a recession. So you can see here, not since the early 60s have we seen a sustained period with unit labor cost growth below zero. We would not be surprised to see that during the next few months. And during the next few years. And the other thing to note is labor is 70% of a total cost on average, not necessarily for a tech company, but for most companies. And so this is also a very important gauge of inflation. There is not a measure of inflation or deflation, but investment as a percent of GDP. It's China in the purple line and the US in the green line. This is total investment, so it includes property, residential and non-residential. And you can see the excesses here in China. China's investment is non-residential. Now, what's the last metric in terms of inflation, deflation? China is very important. Now, what you're seeing here is not a measure of inflation or deflation, but investment as a percent of GDP. It's China in the purple line and the US in the green line. This is total investment, so it includes property, residential and non-residential. And you can see the excesses here in China. China's investment as a share of GDP went to more than twice that of the United States and is still roughly that. Now, the extended lines you see here in different colors, those are IMF projections. We think that the investment line for China will continue to come down. But what this excess in investment suggests is the build out of production capacity and the exporting of more and more deflation. I'm sure a lot of you have heard stories about BYD entering Europe and the Middle East, and its car prices are in the $25,000 range for a very nice car. Our tariffs are so high on them, I think they might be almost 200%, that we don't see that much in the United States. But China is exporting deflation to the point where President Xi Jinping has told its own companies, China's own companies, hey, cut it out. Not only are we exporting deflation and hurting companies in the rest of the world, you're killing each other. So let's get a little more rational. That's why we think this investment line might continue down during the next few years. In the US, with AI and power, both those build outs, especially power being neglected for so long, as opposed to in China. China's building 28 nuclear plants, big ones as we speak. We're building 0. That we think is going to change. So our line will probably start going up to some extent. Here, what I'm trying to illustrate is interest rates track nominal GDP growth. So nominal GDP growth is in the green there. You see the surge because of fiscal and monetary stimulus during COVID and the deceleration thereafter. And you saw the interest rates going up, not nearly as high as that GDP growth rate. This is a year over GDP growth rate. But if we're right, GDP growth is going to stay in the sub 5% range for the next year. And we do expect interest rates to continue falling, mostly because the inflation surprise is likely to be on the low side of expectations. As I mentioned, oil, housing, and unit labor costs. We do believe by the end of the year, though, around the time of the midterm elections, that it will be pretty clear we're in a productivity-driven, perhaps boom in activity. If we get the cyclical whips from housing and autos, perhaps, and the continued momentum in capital spending, we could see some very strong real GDP growth rates, maybe accompanied by lower or negative inflation. That would be the real outlier in terms of expectations, and we would not be surprised to see it.
除了油价和房价，木头姐还拿出了一个更具说服力的证据单位劳动力成本。现在美国的非农单位劳动力的成本同比增速只有 1.4%， 这跟上世纪70年代那种成本推动型的通胀呢，完全是两码事。当时呢是工人要求涨工资因为他自己的生活成本都提高了要求涨工资我才能维持生存嘛，推高了劳动力的成本，进而呢推高了当时的物价。而现在呢，虽然工资在涨，但是生产力涨得更快数据显示，这个生产力的环比年化增速高达 4.9%， 而薪资的增速只有 3%， 这意味着每个工人创造的价值远超他们的工资的增长，所以呢，单位劳动力成本自然就下来了。木头姐甚至预测，在没有经济衰退的情况下，单位劳动力的成本可能会进入到负增长的区间。上一次出现这种情况还是在1960几年60年代。这背后最大的推手呢，就是 AI 带来的生产力的大爆炸。更重要的是呢，它正在重塑整个经济的成本结构带来前所未有的通缩的压力，企业可以用更少的人力生产更多的产品和服务，这直接降低了企业的运营成本，提高了利润率。这种非衰退环境下的单位劳动力成本的下降，是经济健康而且生产力爆炸的一个明确的信号。最后，木头姐还提到了一个被很多人忽视的全球性的因素，中国正在出口通缩。中国巨大的投资占 GDP 的比重，意味着庞大的生产能力。虽然美国对于中国商品征收高额的关税，但中国正在向全球输出大量的更加廉价不断变得廉价的商品。比如说比亚迪的电动车在欧洲和中东只卖 2.5 万美元，性价比极高。虽然美国的高额关税限制了这些商品进入美国市场，但这种全球性的通缩压力会通过国际的贸易和竞争呢，最终传导到美国，进一步降低通胀的预期。木头姐的结论是，我们正处在一个由 AI 驱动的生产力繁荣的周期，通胀会持续的低于预期，甚至可能会出现通缩，这将给美联储带来更大的降息空间，并为那些真正有颠覆性创新能力的公司提供巨大的增长机会。他认为呢，这种生产力驱动的繁荣将是未来几年市场的主旋律，而那些能够利用 AI 来提升效率、降低成本的企业呢，将是最大的赢家。听完木头姐的这番深度的解析，我个人最大的感受是2026年我们或许真的会迎来一个空前的繁荣， AI 和科技驱动的企业利润率的扩张， GDP 会提升，同时呢又没有通胀，在这短期内确实是一个完美的经济状态。但当我们再往后延伸一步，这种生产力大爆炸的背后呢，是不是也隐藏着一些深层的忧虑木头姐在她的这次演讲中其实还提到了一个令人不安的数据，美国刚毕业的大学生失业率高达 12%， 这意味着呢，当 AI 极大的提高了生产力，那些需要重复性、规则明确的工作被自动化取代的时候，最先受到冲击的可能是这些刚刚步入社会的年轻人。美国这个长期以来以消费为立国之本消费占据经济大头的国家，现在正在被 AI 驱动着加速转向一个以生产力驱动为这个根本的一个经济体。这会不会让美国在某种程度上中国化呢？打双引号的大家不要过度解读。但是这种高生产、低通胀、潜在的内需不足、年轻人内需不足这种模式，会不会在未来几年继续扩散？会不会成为我们不得不面对的一个新的问题呢？2026年的繁荣或许是 AI 带来的第一波红利，是一个令人兴奋的阶段。但这个结构性的转变呢，对就业市场、对社会的财富分配对我们习以为常的消费模式，又会带来怎样的深远影响呢？但是至少对于2026我非常认同木头姐的观点，我们将迎来一个由 AI 驱动的没有通胀的空前的生产力爆炸，空前的繁荣。至于未来会遇到什么问题那么我们以后再说了。好了，这就是本期视频的全部内容。大家对木头姐的观点以及我对未来趋势的延伸思考有什么看法？欢迎在评论区留下您的真知灼见。更多内容抢先观看，点击下方链接加入频道会员。